When God chose your kind as the object of his love, I was the first in all heaven to bow down before you. My love, my hope for mankind was no less than his. But I have watched you trample that gift. I've watched you kill each other over race and greed, wage war over dust and rubble and the words in old books. And yet, in the midst of all this darkness, I see some people who will not be bowed. I see some people who will not give up, even when they know all hope is lost. Some people who realize that being lost is so close to being found. You are the reason I still have faith.
It was Hermes Trismegistos who said, "Bright and luminous as you are, O soul, by your own nature, you went to the world of darkness and engaged in combat with it. And the world of darkness obscured your light, and encompassed you with darkness, and blinded you, and made you lose sight of all that you had seen, and forget all that you had known. And in the end, you were captured and held prisoner. And now we're finally getting out, oh you walking dead, who have accessed your inner Tyrese and found the closest thing to home in the Kenoma, or the emptiness that is the universe. We're getting out of this cosmic Shawshank as we recall that we really are so bright and luminous. Here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria through the God above God.Kim.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
We will no longer be captives of lion-headed supreme beings with their leaking penises of conformity, or odious goddesses and their seducing vulvas gorged with material slime. We're getting out, and the chief way to do this is by our simple tenet. Write your own gospel and live your own myth, as the ancient Gnostics were wont to do and persecuted for doing, as any authentic artist or true seeker warrior in the history of the strip mall but Thonian world.
Freedom is life's great lie. Once you accept that, in your heart, you will know peace.
This ethos is certainly exemplified, or more like culminates, when Simon Magus told Simon Peter this remark, as recorded in the Pseudo-Clementine, while they waged their perennial magic war. But you will, as it were bewildered with astonishment, constantly stop your ears that they should not be defiled by blasphemies. And you will turn to flight, for you will find nothing to reply. But the foolish people will agree with you, indeed will come to love you, for you teach what is customary with them. But they will curse me, for I proclaim something new and unheard of.
I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change.
Welcome to the machine and the means to escape it. Welcome, you modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. All learning is remembering, Plato said, and here you're about to have the most amazing total recall you've ever had. That peak experience Maslow wrote about, that Faculty X Colin Wilson discovered. I am Abraxas, that terrible god above the god as the ancients knew him. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, that dream of you, that ship smoke on the horizon, that madman across the waters of creation. I come to you in my meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. As smooth as a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, as cool or wanting to be as cool as Bill Nye, as sublime as the forehead of Christina Ricci, as majestic as the jawbone of Ron Perlman.
We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives.
On this early November, the year of our demiurge 2014, we have the titanic pleasure and honor and ecstasy of being joined once again at the virtual Alexandria by Gary Lachman to discuss his new work, Revolutionaries of the Soul, Reflections on Magicians, Philosophers, and Occultists. The book is a collection of articles from Gary, addressing the greatest mystic-minded of modernity, from Levi to Crowley, from Blavatsky to Jung, from Uspensky to Hall. Like all of his works, Revolutionaries of the Soul is a mind-expanding, reality-dispending read that will stimulate your spiritual clitoris to orgasms of Satori. Gary is certainly one of my favorite scholars on the esoterica, and don't miss any of our past interviews on YouTube, iTunes, or our subscription area on such breathtaking topics as Hermes Thrice Great, politics and the occult, theosophy, and others. For more information on Gary, please visit Gary Lachman, that is Gary LACHMAN.co.uk.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Oh, and a little gnosis in case you find yourself in an Ebola quarantine and need to entertain some soldiers. You know, when you're sitting outside, maybe on a park bench next to a masturbating aqualung, and you're listening to the sounds of nature that might bring you so much peace and serenity. Well, guess what? Those aren't the sounds of divinity, but actually the sounds of thousands of birds, insects, and mammals trying to have sex, or trying to find something to eat because they're mostly on the brink of starvation or eradication. It's not the circle of life.
Mother Nature is a serial killer.
That doesn't mean you can't enjoy the outdoors, but maybe have a little compassion for nature instead. Offer them a prayer that their inner light be released from the world of generation, just like the Manichaeans did when they were out and about.
We are gray. We stand between the candle and the star.
I also should repeat the wisdom of Gary Lachman, who once said on the show, and as well repeats this in Revolutionaries of the Soul, that, quote-unquote, being in the now, as New Agers like to say, is far from any gnosis or even mystic experience. It's actually a more egotistic thing. After all, being truly in the now, and Joseph Campbell would agree, is accessing the eternal realms beyond time and space. Being truly in the now is accessing all times and spaces. Certainly the past and all its overlooked lessons. That total recall and faculty X and peak experience I mentioned at the beginning of the show. That is true freedom and truly being there, with or without Peter Sellers, as everything flows through one point and that one point flows into infinity.
Eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Eternity is that dimension of here and now, which thinking in time cuts out.
This is it.
This is it.
This is my...
If you don't get it here, you won't get it anywhere. And the experience of eternity right here and now is the function of life.
Let me quote Hermes from the Corpus Hermeticum once again, when he said, "Make yourself grow to a greatness beyond measure. Free yourself from the body. Raise yourself above all time. Become eternity. Then you will understand God."
Solitude is the only peace.
There is no way out of here. It will be dark soon.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there, or any type of support you can conceive. Please don't forget to support my Patreon campaign, where you donate every time I produce. And together, we can continue growing the endless soundtrack of the counterculture, one of the greatest heretical communities in the history of the multiverse. Just check out the links at thegodabovegod.com. Your support is essential, and much appreciation to you Pied Pipers at the gates of dawn who support this sacrilege on a weekly basis.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Soon, in time, as we continue on this weekly blasphemy, you will soar above all material illusion into the tender arms of Sophia. We're getting out of this prison. That is the promise of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. You shall do so many wonders in and beyond life and death. I just know it. I just know it. Like Simon Magus, the father of all heresies and the true archetype of the magician, you will proclaim something new and unheard of that will break the bars of all the prisons in your life. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Gary Lachman on Revolutionaries of the Soul. Let us also unleash our inner ayahuasca and do even more wonders. Hello and goodbye as always.
When you come to think of it, almost all human behavior and activity is not essentially any different from animal behavior. The most advanced technologies and craftsmanship bring us, at best, up to the super chimpanzee level. Actually, the gap between, say, Plato or Nietzsche and the average human is greater than the gap between that chimpanzee and the average human. The realm of the real spirit, the true artist, the saint, the philosopher, is rarely achieved. Why so few? Why is world history and evolution not stories of progress, but rather this endless and futile addition of zeros? No greater values have developed. Hell, the Greeks 3,000 years ago were just as advanced as we are. So what are these barriers that keep people from reaching anywhere near their real potential? The answer to that can be found in another question, and that's this. Which is the most universal human characteristic? Fear or laziness?
There is no way out of here. It will be dark soon. There is no way out of here.
It'll be dark soon. No.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined again by Gary Lachman to discuss his new and wonderful book, Revolutionaries of the Soul, Reflections on Magicians, Philosophers, and Occultists. How are you doing today, Gary?
I'm fine, Miguel. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Like we were talking, it's election day, so a lot of uproar out there, but we'll get our own little uproar with this wonderful book and the history of
I hope
Occult.
this won't keep you from voting.
Exactly. Well, you know me, the perennial anarchist. I'll just be complaining here. But, well, why don't you tell us about Revolutionaries of the Soul and how it came to be conscious on paper?
Well, it was actually an idea by a friend of mine, an editor at Quest Books, Richard Smoley, who's also a writer in his own right, as it were. And I'd already did a couple books for Quest, Politics, the Occult, and my book on P.D. Uspensky. And a while ago, the idea came up of collecting some of my articles and essays, because I've written a lot of articles and essays and so on for different journals and magazines over the years. And so that was the basic idea. And so I went through a selection of these articles and sent them off, and they sifted through them, and the ones they focused on, the ones they wanted to do, were the sort of mini biographies, the little potted biographies I did on people like Madame Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner, Swedenborg and Jung, and so on and so on. And so we collected about, I think there's 16 of those. And there's the usual suspects, as I said, Steiner and Crowley, Jung, Uspensky, but there's some lesser-known people, or people who don't get as much attention as they should. People like Owen Barfield, who was a great friend of C.S. Lewis. He was one of the Inklings, but he's also a remarkable philosopher of language and consciousness in his own right. Jean Gebser, who was a German philosopher, spiritual philosopher in the 20th century, who wrote a remarkable book called The Ever-Present Origin. And Colin Wilson, who, as I'm sure you know, wrote a remarkable number of books, groundbreaking ones like The Outsider and The Occult and Mysteries and so on, and who sadly passed away last year at the end of, early December in 2013. And so we put those together, and I wrote an introduction, and lo and behold, there was another book, and it was fun to do because I hadn't looked at many of these things before, and it was interesting to see them over a span of time of nearly 20 years. So it was kind of a survey of my career so far, if I may sound so pretentious.
No, you're not. It's a great book. And before we really get into the book, you use the word soul in your title, which is, of course, Greek for psyche, and that's appropriate in mind consciousness. And you, in your articles and in other interviews, have called yourself a scholar of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I know we've discussed consciousness in our past interviews, but to you, what exactly is consciousness, Gary? And how does it relate to some of these figures that you wrote about in Revolutionaries of the Soul?
Well, I mean, what is consciousness? I mean, we could be, talking quite some time on that one. I think
you don't have like an airport elevator pitch when somebody accosts you in public.
On that one for a few millennia, but
for the next movie.
I don't know. I mean, Henri Bergson, who's one of the philosophers I have written about, not in this collection, but in other books, he said, consciousness is something that's so immediate to us that we don't, we can't define it. It's this fundamental. It's fundamental to our experience of ourselves, and so on and so on. But I mean, certainly, I'm sure you know what we mean with certain kinds of changes of consciousness. We have a everyday consciousness that gets us through the day most of the time, and it's characterized by a kind of sharp definition between our inner and the outer world, and the outer world is made of solid things, and those things are made of matter, and so on and so on. And we in general, we take this stuff, matter, this hard, impermeable kind of paste that things are made out of, which incidentally no one's ever experienced or seen ever. They've seen things made of matter, but no one's ever seen matter itself. In any case, we take that as really real. But in some of these other kinds of states of consciousness, altered states of heightened consciousness, of gnosis, of spiritual experience, things aren't quite as cut and dry as that, clear cut and black and white, and there's a kind of permeableness between our inner and our outer world, and there's also a broadening and intensification and expansion of our immediacy and vividness to our consciousness, and so on and so on, and in different forms, different kinds of consciousness emerge, but it's a kind of unifying thread through pretty much everything I've written, I would say. I mean, and fundamentally, I did one book called The Secret History of Consciousness about 10 years ago, and which brought together several different how should we say it, non-scientistic or materialistic philosophies or ideas about consciousness, and some of the people I've written about in that book appear in Revolutionaries of the Soul. But just to say that that whole idea of a kind of secret history of consciousness is sort of a continuing thread, I would say, throughout most of everything I've written. It's sort of the fundamental kind of idea, either trying to understand, relate these different philosophies, bring them together, or they all kind of a jumble of different things, or do they relate to each other in a coherent way that as I believe they do, that indicates, in a certain sense, there's a whole other mode, a whole other side of our experience that we sort of relegate to a kind of dismissive minor sort of role. In fact, I mean, that fundamental idea, that kind of split, I've been working on a book with that being sort of the fundamental sort of, say, archetypal kind of structure to it, this kind of parallel, this split that runs through human consciousness in the West with periodic kind of fusions of the two. We can say like rational everyday consciousness and this sort of mystical, more intuitive, magical consciousness, which either run on parallel tracks or they crash into each other, but occasionally they come together. I think you can see in history periods where that sort of kind of creative fusion happen, these kind of punctuations throughout history. And in any case, so this is like a fundamental idea. And so, I mean, again, the title, Revolutionaries of the Soul, I have to credit Richard Smoley again, because we Quest and I we couldn't come up with a title both of us liked. And he offered that, and I thought it worked well, because it just shows that, well, as I say in the introduction to the book, the people that I write about, they were both, you can say, revolutionary or evolutionary in their approach to their inner worlds, but also they lived during remarkable times, many of them. I mean, Blavatsky was an actual revolutionary to some extent, where she fought on the barricades with Garibaldi and so on against the papal army and so on, Mazzini. And Uspensky was anti-revolutionary. He was a White Russian, but he with Gurdjieff and others from the early groups in St. Petersburg escaped, through an exploding Russia, collapsing in World War I, and then the Bolshevik Revolution, and so on and so on. Gebser escaped from first Nazi Germany, then from Franco's Spain, and then from Vichy France. It just seemed to me a kind of parallel between this kind of inner adventuring and also this kind of actual, not necessarily exploits, but you know what I mean, unconventional lives, led in the world. I mean, in one sense, the most stable or sober one would have to be Steiner, I would say, because he did very little other than lecture for about 20 years. But everybody else was kind of in a certain way running around or having crazy things happen to them. But even Steiner, the Nazis wanted to assassinate him, so he lived a life of danger.
Yeah, they definitely led very Indiana Jones types of lives while they were seeking expanded consciousness. They were out there doing stuff. That's definitely one commonality, or the two ones, consciousness, and somehow they really led, again, very amazing.
You get this idea that, the idea of people interested in consciousness are sitting home meditating all the time, or, in a lotus position or some other kind of, very tranquil, kind of posture, which, I mean, you wish, you wish you could spend a lot of time like that. So it was, kind of, as I said, sort of a parallel of these two sorts of creative lives.
Right, and of course, living in Europe in the 19th and 20th century, there was always something going on. Some war was going to displace you. You were going to go here. It was never, you couldn't sit still, really.
No, absolutely.
And another commonality, and I wanted to go with a few of them, is beginning with Eli Levy, and who you call the father of modern occultism, is that many of these figures are always trying to find a primordial religion or race. Blavatsky, Manly Hall. Why do you think that was up in the air in those days?
Well, I mean, that's very much a central theme in the Western esoteric tradition itself, this idea of some ancient wisdom. I mean, even as long ago as the roots, more or less, of the Western esoteric tradition, which most people put to sort of Alexandria, in the first few centuries of the Christian era. Even then, they looked then at that time, which is 2 millennia ago for us, they looked back to the ancient wisdom itself, which came from Egypt or from Moses or Zoroaster. So there is this long-standing tradition of what you call a kind of primal revelation, which is the source of the perennial philosophy, the philosophy that is always true and always has been true, or what they call the Prisca Theologia, the freshest, the primal theology. This is the basic, religion, and it's this kind of revelation that was given or had by these sage philosopher figures like Hermes Trismegistos, who I've written about, or Zoroaster, or Moses, and some other characters down the line. But they seem to be the founding, figures, and they received this revelation at the dawn of time, as it were. And there's this kind of cascade of wisdom, as I call it, falling from adept to adept. And so Hermes teaches his disciples, and then it gets handed down. And there's what's called the golden chain, the Hermetic chain. So it's Hermes and Zoroaster has it, and they give it to Orpheus, and he gives it to Pythagoras, and Pythagoras passes it on. Plato gets it, and then it comes down to the Alexandrian time, where you have the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics, and also the early Hermetists, as well as early Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Greek philosophers, all blended into this remarkable, city. And it's at that time that all of that came together into what we call, now like this Western esoteric tradition. So I'm saying even back then, 2,000 years ago, they looked back to some ancient sacred wisdom and some primal revelation. And one of the ideas I've been working on is relating this to an earlier form of consciousness that was more participatory, rather than our own, as I said, rigidly defined consciousness that has a distinct outer and a distinct inner world. And my inner world is fundamentally private. It's a little pool of consciousness in my head, and you don't know what's going on in my head now, and nobody else knows, and so on and so on. Whereas we all share this outer world. At an earlier time, several thinkers have suggested that wasn't the case, and there was, as I said before, the inner and outer is much more permeable. We shared an inner world in a way that we only do now in rather unusual sort of states, what we call altered states, and so on and so on. And so perhaps this kind of archetype or sort of founding idea of some ancient primordial wisdom comes from a time when we had a more intuitive, participatory, mystical kind of relation to the world around us. And this idea is found in several different people like Steiner, and in different ways, people like Gebser, people like Owen Barfield, other ones that ones I talk about in the book and throughout all of my writings.
Another commonality, Gary, and this one's probably not so romantic, but you do note it in your book, is that many of these, like Blavatsky, Manly Palmer Hall, in their later years, tend to gain weight and become manipulated by their students. Why do you see this, Gary? Is it the weight of life, or what's going on?
I don't. That's an interesting question. I don't know if the two always go together, because I'm sure there are some rather slim gurus who get manipulated by their students as well, and perhaps some overweight ones who are not manipulated at all. But I don't know. It just seems to be something that generally happens. Well, as we say, it's not uncommon for someone in a teacher kind of position that creates a kind of a world around themselves of disciples and followers and so on with all the best intentions to get isolated and cut off from the world, in quotation marks. And I mean, at the top of my head, I can think of two. One was Uspensky in his last days, which is very sad, and also Dion Fortune, not quite the same way, but also they became very isolated. Uspensky drank himself to death, and more or less. And Dion Fortune developed leukemia. And they both died relatively young, in their 60s. But in any case, but the overweight thing, I don't know. This was something that was once in one of his books. I think Colin Wilson pointed it out. Just sort of, by the way, incidentally, in the last years, Gurdjieff became quite large. Crowley, we know, became quite large. Blavatsky was perhaps not always as large as she was. I don't think she was ever slim. I haven't seen any pictures of her being really slim. And Uspensky put on quite a bit of weight. Steiner didn't, as far as I know. Jung, I think, was pretty much the same throughout his life. So I don't know. I mean, some people have speculated that something about their astral or their etheric body somehow. They've developed. Say Crowley, Gurdjieff, Blavatsky. They also exhibited, to some degree, certain kinds of powers, or at least were said to. I give them the benefit of the doubt, and I forget who it was, but someone speculated that perhaps because of that, to somehow support that, they needed to put on this extra kind of physical mass, or somehow because it generated the energy for it or something. I don't know. This is something that, as I said, someone just mentioned in a book somewhere. So, but yeah, it's just something that I point to in the book. It's one of these things when you start looking at it saying, oh my God, well actually that did happen. They all seem to be like that. So I don't know. Maybe somebody out there has some ideas. So if they do, I'm very happy to hear any possibilities.
Well, maybe you and I could make a lot of money by opening restaurants at OTO and Freemason lodges and start telling people.
I mean, both Crowley and Gurdjieff were good cooks. I mean, Gurdjieff was supposed to be a remarkable cook. I mean, Blavatsky didn't cook at all. I mean, I think she, one of her favorite dishes was sort of fried eggs in melted butter or something like that. So, no wonder, she was not particularly petite.
I guess they did have appetites for a living. I mean,
that's true.
Seems to be a theme.
That's another thing. I when you think about these people, I mean, none of them were concerned about their health. There was not all this health and well-being kind of sensibility that is associated with spirituality these days. I mean, they didn't give a damn. Madame Blavatsky didn't give a hoot. Not to say, I'm not advocating it, but when you think about them, they live with the kind of intensity that. They sort of held the body in contempt in many ways, which is something that we, that's not part of that's considered, I don't know what it is. That's something that's spiritually incorrect these days, or something. We're supposed to be very kind of conscious of our health and well-being and all that kind of thing. But I mean, all of the great, spiritual figures for me of, say, the 19th and early 20th century, they were, many of them, they were, sick. Dostoevsky was epileptic. Nietzsche's whole philosophy of strength and vitality, he said, came from his sickness, from his times of convalescence, and all that. In any case, we're getting off the track, but this is something I didn't point this out in the book that much, but this is something that I think is true of these early pioneers.
Speaking of somebody who also had contempt, but he basically had contempt for everything, and I did mention to you in a past interview that my first book ever on occultism was Julius Evola's The Hermetic Tradition, and it really opened my eyes. It was wonderful. Yeah. But I'm amazed, again, going back to contempt, is that how, again, contemptuous Evola was for everything. I mean, he made the ancient Gnostics seem lukewarm. He rejected capitalism, liberalism, humanism, socialism, and everything. How does such a mind become so radical against everything and yet so brilliant at understanding, the reality behind reality?
Well, I think it's probably, Evola's brilliance that led him to be so contemptuous. Because if you're halfway intelligent, you see a lot of stupidity around you most of the time.
Right.
So he had very sharp, clear, strong ideas about spirituality and consciousness and culture and life in general. I mean, I've always found him the most readable of the traditionalists. He touched on lots of different things. I mean, and he also lived up into the 70s, so he was writing in relatively modern. Well, he was writing in more or less modern times in the end, and he adhered to this strange idea of this primordial tradition that he had unearthed, and everything was a falling away of it. I mean, it's understandable. I mean, there's a certain, how should we say it? There's a certain enjoyment to be had from recognizing the utter contemptuousness of everything around you except your own brilliant intellect, and as we all do. I indulge in it sometimes myself, but I know exactly what you mean. But he's very bracing. I mean, if you can get past his politics, I mean, I don't care for his politics, but I can understand where they come from. But he does have a great command of the esoteric tradition. But he has a particular axe to grind. He has a particular agenda, and I have to say, I do find his sort of north-south split between, the sort of solar, Hyperborean, masculine north and the lunar, Lemurian, or whatever it is, feminine south, a bit too neat. But any case, he certainly can be bracing.
And I know you touched this on politics and the occult, but reading people like Evola, Manley, Hall, Uspensky, sometimes there almost seems to be some sort of right-wing sensibility to mysticism. And it's kind of disturbing because we're supposed to, people in the occult are supposed to be open-minded and everything. Yeah. But these guys, and many of them, just went right into anti-Semitism. Why do you think is this weird disconnect?
I don't know about Uspensky being anti-Semitic.
No, Evola.
Certainly Evola, and I don't know about Manly Hall, but I know what you mean. But there's a couple sort of basic reasons why, but I'll just point out, as given that you mentioned it already, politics and the occult. I mean, one of the questions I look at in that book is that true? Is it true that occultism and esotericism is always linked to right wing politics? And I show actually no. I mean, there's a great many what you would call left or progressive occult politics as well. But I mean, I think the basic idea is that the esoteric and the mystical and the occult tends to be linked to tradition, tends to be linked to the past. We've talked about this kind of primordial fundamental revelation, whereas progressive politics by definition is aiming at the future, and it's more associated with the left. It's more associated with the sort of notion of a kind of scientific sort of state and all that. And so many of the late 19th or early 20th, certainly early 20th century esoteric thinkers like Uspensky, but also people like W.B. Yeats and Evola to a far more rabid, you might say, degree, had kind of, more right, what we would call right-wing kind of political leanings. I mean, Uspensky certainly had it because he hated the Bolsheviks, but he saw it firsthand. He saw, basically more or less the Bolsheviks doing to some degree what the so-called Islamic State is doing, now. Basically going and shooting people and, for the good of the revolution, whatever it is, for the cause, for the good of the cause, which is supposed to bring, in some way the millennium. In some way, Uspensky saw people being, killed left and right, and he talks about a kind of, history of crime and this struggle between, culture and barbarism. And, and he saw the Bolshevik Revolution as the kind of triumph of barbarism and so on and so on. And it's also linked, in a broad way. Well, this is one of the paradoxes. You bring it up. It's linked in a broad way to a criticism of modernity, which is also linked. Modernity itself is linked to notions of egalitarianism, which many of these people saw as a leveling, the doing away with tradition, the doing away of a hierarchical view of things, of where there's higher spiritual things, ideal things at the top, let us say, and material, physical, carnal, whatever kinds of things at the bottom, and that kind of that hierarchy had been broken, and it was anything goes and all that anarchy and so on and so on. But I myself, I'm a product of that kind of democratization. I became interested in this kind of stuff not through, a tap on the shoulder by some emissary of the secret society, but by looking at cheap paperbacks, that were available for mass consumption. And most people from my generation were. So, in a way, it's, and as you say, today, all this kind of stuff is taken up by counterculture, kind of in a broad sense, which is generally progressive, right? Because it wants liberties and so on and so on and so on. So it's a strange kind of paradox. But I think there's personal reasons, there's historical reasons, but there's also, I think, reasons to do with. I mean, we immediately that knee-jerk sense that the right must be bad and wrong, and the left are good. They're the good guys, which is itself a leftover from that whole period. And because when you look at, as we say, the kinds of the sort of ideology that the people were talking about being right wing were criticizing, those things don't appeal to us too much either. There's problems with the left ideology as well, and so on and so on. So yeah, but it's in generally there's a link between esotericism and a more conservative view of things, because it wants to preserve things from the past that it sees that are still of value, and so that they're not just kind of bulldozed over by this ongoing march into the progress into the future.
And at the same time, Gary, and of course this might not be very uncommon because today is election day here in the United States, so every politician is promising a golden age. But all these, many of these figures in your book were also always talking about a new age. I mean, Crowley, Blavatsky, and you even say Jung basically championed the idea of an age of Aquarius. So they're also saying things, we're turning a corner and it's a new age of consciousness too.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, but again, that's another standard theme in the whole, I mean, not only Western esoteric tradition, but in Western, sort of the Western mind from the beginning. There's always been this notion of some golden age of some kind that we've either fallen from, or we're returning to, or we're moving our way up to in some way. And I mean, again, it all depends how you understand it. Again, I tend to think of it in terms of evolution of consciousness, or as the philosopher Jean Gebser speaks of it, what he calls different structures of consciousness. And as I was saying earlier, at a much earlier time in human evolution, say, at a period ending perhaps at the end of the last ice age, we had a much more participatory experience with the world around us. This rigid distinction between inner and outer world wasn't the case, and something much more dreamlike, let us say, or something much more like some kinds of experiences, we have under hallucinogens or so on, was the norm to some degree. And people like Steiner and Gebser and Owen Barfield and Schwaller de Lubitsch and many others say something similar. And so, I think since we have, or this archetype, or this kind of yearning to some degree, well, you can say there's two different kinds of golden age. There's that kind of golden age, the one you want to get back to, something you left. And then there's the kind of golden age that's supposed to be created by us through our own, efforts, through, science and progress and the rational state and so on and so on. And, both of them have a certain attraction, and both of them have, certain drawbacks. So, and this is something that's typical. I was going to say, I think this is typical of times of crisis, that we can say, or as the historian Arnold Toynbee called them, times of trouble. And he said this a long time ago. He said there are two typical kinds of responses to when a culture goes through times of crisis, and one is what he called the archaic, this sense of returning to an earlier prior time when things were better, or the futuristic, which was the sense of being transported into some future golden age when science or man is able to master all of reality and create the world around himself that he wants completely, which would be I think a hell, basically. That would be a cosmic disaster. But in any case, so you can say the kind of esoteric version of that is the the getting back to the garden kind of, the prelapsarian return to our earlier spiritual state before the fall, as against the scientistic, you can throw Marx in there as a kind of version of that, because he considered his philosophy to be a kind of science, that these things were inevitable, and so on and so on. But in certainly the way, in more contemporary terms of our belief that in some way technology and pharmacology and other sorts of scientific pursuits will solve all our problems.
And Gary, is there any figure in your book who you really find inspirational or have an extra affinity to? Any of these figures you feel you have a sort of kindred to? I'm getting that you really enjoyed Owen Barfield, but that's because you actually interviewed him face to face.
Well, let's see. At least two of the people in the book I met. Owen Barfield I met once. Colin Wilson I got to know, and we became friends, and I knew him for quite some time. I knew him for about 30 years. Manly P. Hall I never met, but I used to see him speak at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. Barfield, yes, I interviewed him in 1996, and I pretty sure I did the last interview with him because I believe he died the year later, and at 99. And he was a remarkable man, a remarkable life. As I said, he was a good friend of C.S. Lewis. He knew Tolkien. He was part of this group, the Inklings, that used to meet in the pub Eagle and Child in Oxford. But he had an early career, writing career in the 1920s. And he wrote a first book called History in English Words, which is a remarkable book that sees the evolution of consciousness through changes in language. And then he did a couple other books at that time, but then he basically saw that he couldn't make a living as a writer, and so he went and joined his family's law firm and worked as a solicitor, more or less, for many, many years. And then in his 60s, he came back with a book called Saving the Appearances, in which he develops this whole notion that he talks about participation. He talks about original participation, which I was talking about earlier, this earlier time in human evolution when our consciousness was much more participatory with the world around us. And then this period we've been going through for the last, 2 millennia or so, where a sense of increasing separation from the world around us, and increasing localization of consciousness. And as I said before, my inner world is, fundamentally private. Barfield would say that whereas we now have an inner world that we experience within our own individual heads, more or less, at an earlier time, the outside world had an inner world as well, and we were in that too, to some degree. But in any case, then he does talk about this next stage, which he calls a final participation, which is, again, this participatory form of consciousness comes back, but without us losing our individual egos, without losing our kind of rational selves and sense of I, and so on, which was less well developed in the period of original participation. But it was remarkable meeting him and spending the afternoon talking with him when I did. And someone who had lived almost for a century and had lived through World War I, World War II, everything up until just I said he died just before the end of the century. And then Colin Wilson, I met him for the first time in the early 1980s when I was traveling on my own through England and hitchhiking and so on. And I got down to Cornwall, and I'd already been a great reader of his books, and was intent on meeting him. And somehow I got his telephone number from someone in London. I forget exactly who now, and called him when I was down in Penzance, because he lived down in Cornwall, at the bottom end, the West Country of England here. And he was very friendly and inviting and generous and so on. And I went and stayed, and we talked and so on. And then over the years, I corresponded with him, and it's basically his influence, or his kind of model or example, that made me really want to try to become a writer. I'd always wanted to write. I say in the beginning of the book that if my first sort of impulses towards that came out in my teens, when I was late teens, and when I was writing poetry, and then that got turned into songwriting. I was a musician for quite some time, but the idea of writing, write as I do today, it always stayed with me. but it took a very long time for me to ever, write something that was worth reading, or at least that an editor wouldn't send back. And I just became a great reader of his books. They're so readable, and his ideas about consciousness, more or less formed the baseline for my own work, I would say. I think he's one of the most important philosophers of consciousness of the 20th into the early 21st century. And when I finish the book I'm working on now, my next project is to do a book about Colin Wilson and about his work, his ideas. Especially, I'm going to focus on his sort of early work in philosophy, and because he developed this whole thing that he called the New Existentialism, based on his insights into consciousness, and it's something that I believe deserves more attention than it got.
Well, I certainly agree with you on Colin Wilson. And going back to Owen Barfield and his ideas of how consciousness participates in creating reality, which he was talking about way before Deepak Chopra or any of those guys. But
and way before John Wheeler, the physicist, most associated with that notion. No, certainly, yeah.
But speaking of being separated, he didn't like the internet, didn't he? He thought it was really fragmenting us, and we were just creating our own looping realities.
Well, I mean, this man is, almost 100 when he was talking about it, but he commented that, I think he recognized the sort of value of it, but which at the same time, this isn't anything new. I mean, it's something that, while it can facilitate something like this, what we're having, it can also facilitate lots of rubbish and all that. And I think he, just recognized there was, just like, my television set gets like 500 channels, but I watch one or two of them maybe, there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of chatter out there. So I think he was quite, aware of that. But yes, you're right. He did feel that it was something that, as I said, kind of facilitated this kind of atomistic sort of character that he recognized as part of our own time, which to me, again, that tied in very well with this philosopher Jean Gebser, because one of Gebser's ideas that I think is borne out by our times is what he called. He said we were experiencing the breakdown of what he called the mental rational consciousness structure, and it had entered its deficient phase. And to try and put it briefly, there have been four consciousness structures so far for Gebser, and he calls it the archaic, the magical, the mythic, and the mental rational. The mythic would have been this participatory one I was talking about earlier, and the earlier two are the previous two are even so kind of embedded in our individual consciousnesses at an absolute minimum, if there's any at all, and it's so firmly embedded in the actual experience of the world. It's something like, say, the consciousness of plants today would be, or minerals, or something like that. But Gebser said that from around, say, 1200 BC, at the beginning, this was like the first signs of this new kind of consciousness structure, this mental rational structure, which is characterized by this kind of, separation. More complete separation of human consciousness from the surrounding, world around it. Our consciousness became less and less participatory, and you can see this. You can see the rise of, rationality, the rise of sort of, the early Greek philosophers, scientists, Thales and Anaximander, and so on and so on. They're no longer talking about the gods so much, and talking about the myths, but they're asking questions like, what is this made of, and so what's the fundamental principle of reality, and so on and so on. And so this is a necessary development, absolutely essential, and indispensable for human evolution, and so on and so on. But as all of these structures do, they reach a certain period when they've ripened completely, and then they start to kind of get overripe. And this is when they enter what he calls their deficient mode, and that's what we've been in. He's saying since about the 15th century or so, something like that. And it's in recent times it's really put the pedal to the metal, as it were. It's sped up quite a bit. But Gebser isn't completely in despair, because he believes that this kind of breaking up of this late form of the mental rational consciousness structure is in preparation for this fifth stage, which he calls the integral, which would be an integration of the previous four. And he saw signs of this coming up. And likewise, how he describes what he says is the signs of this kind of this new integrating structure of consciousness is paralleled by things that someone like Barfield would say, or someone like Steiner, or so and so on. And that's what I find fascinating about writing about all these different figures, is that you start to see very strong parallels. You start to see it's as if all of them are looking at the same thing from a different perspective, but they sort of see edges of what the others see full on. And you, each of them you can kind of put the parts of the jigsaw puzzle together. At least for someone like myself, who tries to keep abreast of tries to be aware of all the different ideas about these things, rather than focusing on, okay, well, I'm a Jungian, or I'm a anthroposophist, a follower of Steiner, or I'm a Gurdjieffian, or so on and so on.
On the other side of affinity, I was pretty amazed at your article on Crowley, and of course you talk about, like everybody else, you were impressed because he was such a rebel and he was such a counterculture figure. But when you put a list of his shenanigans in condensed form, that was really rough. I mean, the man was mean, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, I have a soft place for Crowley, even though I'm very critical of him, and in many ways I feel sorry for him, because he was brilliant. Extremely, talented, brilliant, and had flashes of genius, but he just sort of got it wrong at an early age. And he's just one of these people who, if you tell them to stop, they just go faster. And
like a kid.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's precisely it. He's like a kid who never grew up. He had this, this repressive, fundamentalist Christian upbringing, but also he was also a spoiled rich kid. So, I mean, that in itself strikes me as a recipe for, something. It's as if you've got, you've been shaking the bottle for a long time, and, the cork finally comes out. It overflows, and that's sort of what, Crowley did. Once he was able to get away from his fundamentalist Christian folks and get his hands on his inheritance, he just went for it. And, he lived large. He had the supersized life and took tons of drugs and had lots of sex and incredible exploits. But he also, he was, I think the sad thing about him is that he just didn't, I don't know how to say it. He combined this kind of, as you said, revolutionary, in the sense of, breaking with convention and not conforming and so on and so on. But also he had this ineradicable need to sort of, give the finger to, authority, whatever it was around him, but he just completely got obsessed with that. He didn't outgrow it. Most of us outgrow it, and he didn't outgrow it. So, but what I say because I did a book on him recently too, I say that he deserves a round of applause, because he showed us that this doesn't work. This whole kind of philosophy of excess, that's sort of like the default setting. If you don't want to be conventional, if you don't want to conform, if you don't want to do 9 to 5, then the default setting for the rebel is this kind of life of excess, and craziness and wildness and all that kind of thing. And it's fun for a while, but Crowley just shows you that in the long run, it just doesn't work as a philosophy for life. It just, and it's nothing moral about that. It's just practical. It just doesn't work. But he was remarkable in many ways. I try to give him credit. He did explore areas of consciousness most of us have no idea about, he did have I think he had a very muddled sense that we sell ourselves short. We could be much more than we could be, which sounds like an advertisement for the army or something. But I just mean the sense that we kind of don't recognize all of the potential we have, and I think he had a sense of that, but his means of accessing it was, I think, fundamentally flawed. But that article was written for, there was a issue of the Fortean Times that was dedicated to him, and there was, it was a kind of all Crowley issue. So I took the job of, being the bad guy.
Yeah, but it seems more than anybody in your book, he really was an outcast, because he was the kind of person, he truly didn't belong in society, because he only found peace when he was outside of civilization.
Absolutely.
That's when he was free.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely. Well, again, he's one of these characters. I think, in many ways, that's why I feel sorry for him, because he probably was full of a lot of energy and he didn't know what to do with it. You know what I mean? I don't think he had a very good idea what to do with it, and his philosophy that basically just leave me alone and let me do what I want to do, which is fundamentally, I think, what do what thou wilt is about. Even though I know it doesn't really mean do what you like, it means do what thou wilt, and I know everything about love is the law, love is the will, and all that. But if you look at how Crowley actually expressed this, how he acted it out, it was more or less let me do whatever I want to do, and leave me alone. And so I don't think he really knew what to do with this energy he had, and I think that was one of the problems he had. He was very creative, had a lot of energy, had all this money, and he had a repressive childhood. So it just turned into,
a beast.
Yeah, he made a philosophy out of, basically I just want to do whatever I want to do and don't bother me about it. Which all of us would really like, but we fundamentally, I think we realize that it just doesn't work like that.
No, especially at his ending. And Gary, it seems to me we really don't have any great occultists in our present era, unless you want to include, I don't know, Oprah or Terence McKenna or Bill Hicks or somebody like that. But and you could say, well, I'm missing something because I'm in the present. But as you write, these figures in your book were basically rock stars and very public in their days. They were adulated and hated by the press and other institutions. They were out there. We really have nothing like this right now.
Well, the thing is, I think it's whatever you want to call it, the occult or something, is it's been domesticated in many ways. It's part of our kind of culture. So these figures won't seem quite as unusual, let's say. And you got to remember, you put yourself back in the 20s and 30s when Crowley was getting in the tabloids. He was somebody that would have turned up in, I don't know, there used to be the National Enquirer when I was a kid. I don't know if it's still around anymore in the States, but it was a paper dedicated to all this weird stuff. Here in the UK, a lot of the dailies, I guess the Post maybe or something in New York would do it. But in any case, what I'm saying, it's a lot of people like Crowley did turn up in kind of, the sensational newspaper stuff. But I also think, the kinds of things that these people devoted their lives to is much more accessible now. Everything's available on the net. All this stuff, none of this stuff is really secret. I think you could probably still find groups that are trying to keep a low profile and don't advertise and so on and so on. But in general, yeah, I don't know if... Again, at the same time, I myself, I have my head turned to the past. I first came across these people almost 40 years ago, many of them, and I became fascinated with them then. And you can say that I've been working out the consequences, implications of that early kind of interest. So I don't know. There might be people today. I'm just not aware of them. But I don't get the impression. But I know there's certainly, here in London, there's a very lively, vibrant, esoteric community. There's certainly at least 3 good, well-stocked bookstores going, and each of them have, talks and lectures and so on and so on. And on top of that, there's free-floating kind of groups that meet and so on. So I think there's a broader grassroots interest in this kind of stuff, and also that in itself has different sort of levels or approaches. There's people that are practitioners, there's people that are doing an academic study of this kind of stuff, from a sociological, let's say, or cultural studies point of view, and they all kind of mash up against each other in this occult milieu here in London. But my own interest is mostly in these early figures, because these are the ones I read a lot about, and became quite familiar with, and developed quite a lot of affection for, actually, if I put it that way. As I said, I'm trying to work out the implications of their ideas, but also tying them up with more recent things. For myself, a book that had a big impact on me, that it wasn't occult in any way whatsoever. It's about the brain, neuroscience, is this remarkable book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And he in it, he reboots the whole right and left brain discussion, which had, basically fallen by the wayside because of all of the pop psychology and self-help interest in it, and also in neuroscience itself. They basically discovered that there wasn't a great deal of difference between what the two sides did after all. They do the same things, but what McGilchrist points out, and he's a neuroscientist as well as a sort of humanist, he's got his feet in both camps, is that they may perform the same functions, but how they do things is very different. It's not what they do, it's how they do it. And he says there's a fundamental difference between how the two sides do it. And that, to me, is really created a whole new way to understand this, for me at least, this whole Western esoteric idea, because in many ways you can see it as a form of kind of right brain knowledge. And what McGilchrist says is that there's been throughout history a kind of rivalry, a kind of contest between the two sides of the brain. But in recent years, the last couple centuries, the left seems to have gained an upper hand and hasn't been compensated as much as in the past by the contribution of the right. And so he's saying, like, for the last 200 years, we're increasingly creating a much more left-brain-oriented world and minimizing, diminishing, and even, sort of jettisoning much of the contribution that the right brain sort of makes. And one aspect of that kind of rivalry, or that kind of coup d'état by the left, I would say, is the wholesale dismissal of what the late historian James Webb, who I write about in the book, called rejected knowledge, which is the occult tradition, and Hermetic, and the esoteric tradition. So what I'm basically trying to say is, I think we can see the dismissal, or the kind of relegation to the dust pile of knowledge of the esoteric tradition by the rise of science and rationality and so on, as a kind of assault on right brain forms of knowledge by the left. And so here's a way where I'm looking at these familiar figures, but I'm trying to understand them in terms of this kind of new way of seeing this dialectic between the two sides of the brain.
McGilchrist needs to go climb a mountain or go fight ISIS or date Katy Perry so he can get some press, and we can have another round of occultists. But to end, and you mentioned it, so your next work will be a work on Colin Wilson, a full book.
Well, that's right now. I'm working on something, and the working title is "The Secret Teachers of the Western World," and it's more or less a sort of history of Western esoteric tradition, in terms of what I was just talking about, this kind of dialectic between left and right sides of the brain. With any luck, knock on wood, I'll be finishing that by the end of the year, and then in the new year, after a well-deserved break, I'll start work on a book on Colin Wilson, and the working title on that is Beyond the Robot, the life and work of Colin Wilson, and it'll be more or less an introduction to his ideas.
Well, we certainly look forward to both books, Gary, and I think that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte, and good luck with Revolutionaries of the Soul.
Well, thank you so much, and always a pleasure. Take care.
I'll cut your throat if you squeeze mine. I'll shake your hand. Butterflies will fly out from our union, and they'll see what we have shown. I ain't asking about violations or how to stop. I'm bored to death, but now I'm not. So refresh your mind on your broken soul. This country lays stretched in love. your